Hi, this is David Hess, and you're watching today Rivers of Living Water, and I'm filling in for Dr. Vicky Lund. And today we have an interesting program I think you'll find. It's called Messianic Prophecies that the Rabbis Attempted to Hide. So when we go back to the first century, after the apostolic era, or during the apostolic era, Judaism was in crisis. Why? Because as Jesus prophesied, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And so at that time, there was no longer a temple Judaism in existence. Herod's temple, the second temple, was destroyed, and the Jewish priesthood ended. The crisis that Judaism was in was that 40% of the Mosaic law required there to be a temple and an active priesthood. So at the same time, many Jews were becoming followers of Jesus. The so-called Christian cult was exploding, utilizing the Greek. The Greek was the language of the Roman Empire. And so what we had was the Greek translation of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint, was everywhere, and it was catalytic in leading Jews to Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. And so Judaism was in crisis. And in the time of Jesus, the leadership, there were the Sadducees and there was the Pharisees, were the two main parties. But after the temple was destroyed, it became the rabbis that were the descendants of the Pharisees. And so the rabbis got together at the end of the first century, basically around 90 AD. Imagine your temple's destroyed in Jerusalem, and you're trying to figure out, what do we do with our faith? Because so much of their faith has been taken away, with the temple being destroyed and the priesthood being ended. So what the rabbis did is they convened very close to Tel Aviv today at a place called Jamnia, is how you say it, or Yavne, I think, is another way you say it in Hebrew. But anyway, and the rabbis really had to rethink, what are we going to do with Judaism, our faith? And they shifted away the emphasis from the written law to what was called the oral Torah, or the Mishnah, which became later the basis of the Talmud. And today, the vast majority of Jews in the world are Talmudic Jews. They follow the Talmud. Anyway, so what they really needed to do at this time is they needed to try to stop this Christian movement from continuing to cause Jews to receive Jesus as their Messiah. And so the leader of this school of rabbis was a rabbi named Rabbi Akiba. Akiba died, just to give you an idea, he died in the year 135 AD. So they convened a council, and in this council, they actually attempted to tamper with the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, in order to stop the Christian movement. I think we could consider this one of the greatest conspiracies in the history of the church. And we see this dialogue going on. If you see, there were early Christian writers that were dialoguing with Jews, and they would make this claim to the Jews in the second century that you have tampered with your scriptures, and you've tried to obscure the Messianic prophecies. And another thing that they did is they messed with the Old Testament chronology. And so what I want to do is just share today a little bit about what did they attempt to do with the Bible in order to stop the Christian movement? And ultimately they failed. And I'll also share why that was. Okay, so a couple of ways that they changed or attempted to change the Hebrew Bible was they tampered with Messianic prophecies. I'm going to share a couple of those that they tampered with, and we know what the originals are because one, they're quoted in the New Testament from the Greek Septuagint, and secondly, we've also found them in the Dead Sea Scrolls, showing that in Hebrew, showing that there was a change in the Hebrew text. So what we have, the rabbis, they had their Hebrew Bible that they tampered with in the 2nd century, really between like 90 AD and 110 AD. They were making some changes to their Hebrew Bible. And when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, we found Hebrew manuscripts that predated those manuscripts by several hundred years that actually agree with our New Testament and with the Septuagint. Anyway, I'll share some of that. So they attempted, first of all, to change Messianic prophecies. And the second thing that they attempted to do was they attempted to remove the timeline. They changed the timeline out of the book of Genesis by removing 1,500 years of chronology in Genesis chapter 5, Genesis chapter 11, and also some years out of the book of Daniel. So anyway, this was the rabbis' attempt to slow down this Christian movement. I'm not going to quote their quotes here, but I have quotes from Justin Martyr in the 2nd century. I have quotes from Tertullian around the year 200. These early church leaders, fathers that are making this claim that the rabbis had attempted to tamper with their Bible to somehow cause Jews to not consider Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. Like I said, they attempted to change the Messianic prophecies that the Christians or the Christian movement was using to see Jews come to follow Jesus. Another thing that the rabbis attempted to do was they attempted to the references to the Gentiles being a part of the new covenant. They also attempted to obscure that, so they would make changes in their Hebrew Bible so that it didn't say Gentiles. It might have said the nations or peoples or the countries or the nations, something other than Gentiles. And they also changed language that deified Jesus and that also deified angelic beings called the sons of God or Beni Elohim. I'm butchering the Hebrew with that, but the sons of God. And so they attempted to alter language so that would somehow diminish references to Jesus's deity or Messiah's deity. And secondly, also any reference to sons of God being gods with the small g, somehow to elevate Yahweh and somehow diminish all of these other creatures, created beings. Now, Jesus, of course, is uncreated, but I'm talking about the angels. I've mentioned that they took out time from 1,500 years from the book of Genesis, from the chronology in Genesis, and also the book of Daniel. And interestingly, and this is probably maybe the most controversial point, is that they also narrowed the canon of books that were in their Old Testament. Jews before this time had a broader canon of books that they had in their Old Testament. And the rabbis narrowed it down to the books that we have now in our, most Protestants have in their Bible. I should say most, because the original King James in English had the broader canon. But anyway, so let me share a couple of the prophecies that were altered or changed by the rabbis, and you will see where the accusations came. So the Hebrew Bible today, if you open up Psalm 22 and read the Hebrew Bible, it says, for many dogs encircled me, a gathering of those evils surrounded me. And then it says in verse 16, like a lion, my hands and my feet. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Okay? This psalm is quoted in the book of Matthew, Matthew 27:35. It says this, and when they crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. So what is it that Matthew is quoting? He's quoting the Greek Septuagint, the translation of Psalms. It's Psalm 21 in the Septuagint. It's one off between the Masoretic text, the Hebrew Bible today, and the Greek translation called the Septuagint. But this is what the Septuagint says. For many dogs encircled me, a gathering of those doing evil surrounded me. They pierced my hands and my feet. And then it goes on to say, they distributed my garments among themselves, and they cast a lot for my clothing. So in the Septuagint, you have a prophecy that's contained in the New Testament where it says they crucified him. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, Psalm 21 or 22, depending on whether you're using your Hebrew Bible or the Greek translation, says they pierced my hands and my feet. So the crucifixion was prophesied in the Old Testament, and the rabbis changed the Hebrew Bible. And to this day, Jews will throw up their arms and say, you Christians changed our Bible, or you tampered with the text, because their Jewish Masoretic Hebrew text today that the rabbis canonized or decided upon at the end of the first century and into the early second century, it says, like a lion, my hands and my feet, which doesn't even make sense. They pierced my hands and my feet. The New Testament says they crucified him. Well, what we have is we have a debate. Well, who's right? Psalm 22 or Psalm 21, if you're the Septuagint. Is it like a lion, or is it they pierced my hands and my feet? Anyway, this debate went on for hundreds and hundreds of years. Jews accusing Christians of changing the Hebrew or their Old Testaments, and the Christians saying, no, you guys changed yours. And then in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And it just so happens that we found Psalm 22 in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So predating the Christian era by as many as 300 years. We're not sure exactly how old these two fragments are, but both of these fragments of Psalm 22 have verse 16 and 17. And one of them has verse 18, the other one does not. But here is the Hebrew text of the Dead Sea Scrolls. For dogs have surrounded me, a company of evildoers have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. And the other fragment of Psalm 22 set in Hebrew, for dogs have surrounded me, a company of evildoers have enclosed me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. It goes on and has verse 18. They divide my garments among them. They cast lots for my clothing. So what we have is we have two fragments of the Hebrew Bible of Psalm 22 proving that the rabbis actually attempted to tamper with this Messianic prophecy, which was in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, in the Psalms, it was quoted in Matthew 27, and in Psalm 22 in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it proves that the Hebrew Bible originally prophesied the crucifixions, and the rabbis took it out. Now, we know what the original is because we have the New Testament, we have the Septuagint, and now we have the Dead Sea Scrolls to prove that Psalm 22 was one of the most powerful Messianic prophecies, and yet you don't find it today in the Hebrew Bible, in the Masoretic text. Interesting. There was one example of where the rabbis were attempting to change the Hebrew Bible so that people would not follow Jesus as the Messiah. I go on. How about I mentioned the issue of the Gentiles. Let me read what we have in the New Testament, quoting Isaiah 42. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not quench, until he brings justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will hope. That's what Matthew 12, verses 20 and 21 say. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not quench, speaking of the Messiah, until he brings justice to victory, and in his name, Messiah's name, the Gentiles will hope. So what does the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, say, that was translated as started in 285 BC, before Jesus? He will not crush a bruised reed, and he will not extinguish a smoking flax, but he will bring forth justice to truth. He will blaze forth and will not be shattered until he brings justice upon the earth, and in his name shall the Gentiles trust. So the New Testament is quoting the Septuagint. But what does the Masoretic Hebrew text say that the rabbis tampered with? It says, instead of in his name the Gentiles will hope, it says the islands shall wait for his law. Islands may be a reference to other lands or whatever, shall wait for his law. So what do we have in the original Hebrew Bible that's quoted in the New Testament? We have a mention of the Gentiles, and that salvation will come by believing in his name. We have in the Hebrew Bible that the rabbis tampered with, the reference to Gentiles is taken out. They didn't like Gentiles. And secondly, rather than in the name of Messiah, they will trust, it talks about they will wait for his law. Again, salvation in the law versus salvation in Messiah's name. Anyway, let's look at another messianic prophecy out of Psalm chapter 40. The New Testament in the book of Hebrews, quoting Psalm 40, verse 6. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not delight. So what we see in the New Testament, quoting Psalm 40, is that Messiah would be an atoning sacrifice that would be needed for an atoning sacrifice would be needed for salvation. That matches with the Greek Septuagint, the Old Testament. You did not want sacrifice and offering, but you prepared a body for me. But what do we have in the rabbis' Masoretic text that was changed by the rabbis after Jesus? Sacrifices and offering you did not desire, mine ears you have opened. So we have the whole reference to Messiah being an atoning sacrifice, that his body would be prepared, is taken out, and it says, my ears you have opened. How about Deuteronomy 32? I've just got maybe a couple more here before I get to why they changed the chronology. Hebrews 1 verse 6. And again, when he brings the firstborn Christ into the world, he says, let all the angels worship him. So here we have a clear reference quoting Deuteronomy 32:43 that let all the angels of God worship Messiah. We have his deity on full display. The book of Hebrews is quoting that. And then when you look at Deuteronomy 32 in the Hebrew Bible today, it says, O nations, rejoice his people. That's it. No reference to angels worshiping him. Where do we get that? We get that in the older Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It says this, verse 43 from Deuteronomy, rejoice ye heavens with him, and let all the angels of God worship him. Rejoice ye Gentiles with his people, and let all the sons of God strengthen themselves in him. So Hebrews 1:6, referencing Christ, has an Old Testament prophecy out of Deuteronomy elevating the deity of Jesus. All of the angels are worshiping him. That's in the Greek Old Testament from hundreds of years, several hundred years, before the rabbis. And the rabbis changed the text, remove all of that and say, O nations, rejoice his people. So who's right? Again, we have the Masoretic text saying, O nations, rejoice his people. We have the Septuagint saying, let all the angels of God worship him. And then we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we have a Hebrew fragment quoting Deuteronomy 32:43, saying this, O heavens, rejoice with him, bow to him, all ye gods. And if you know anything about the gods in the Old Testament, with a small g is always a reference to the angels. So we have let all the angels of God worship him. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls in Deuteronomy 32, it says, bow to him, all gods. And yet, when you go into the Hebrew Bible today, and you look at the Masoretic text that the rabbis canonized 100 years after Christ, they've removed that, the reference to angels bowing before him. So, let's move on to one other aspect that I wanted to share with you about another way. I've looked at a couple of Messianic prophecies and shown you that the New Testament, quoting the Old Testament, doesn't match your Old Testament because the rabbis changed their Old Testament, the Hebrew, and then later we find the Dead Sea Scrolls in Hebrew that prove that our quotations in our New Testament are correct, that the Greek Bible, the Septuagint, was not changed but preserved. But that wasn't the only thing that they changed. They changed those Messianic prophecies. There's many others. I've only listed several. But in addition, they removed 1,500 years out of the book of Genesis chapter 5 and chapter 11. Actually, they removed 1,386 years out of Genesis and 165 years out of the book of Daniel. And so, according to the Masoretic, according to the Hebrew, okay, all right, the Old Testament that was translated 300 years before the rabbis, or almost 400 years before the rabbis made these changes, we have Adam living 5,500 BC. So why was this significant? Why would the rabbis have changed the Old Testament chronology? because there was an ancient Jewish tradition that when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, that it would be 5,500 years until Messiah would come. It was called the 5,500 year prophecy. And it appears that this prophecy was one of the most effective means by which Jews were saying, hey, according to our chronology of the Old Testament, we're 5,500 years right now. In the first century, at the time of Jesus, we're 5,500 years after Adam's and Eve were kicked out of the garden. This must be the Messiah. Jesus fits the chronology. And so what did the rabbis do? They went in to Genesis chapter 5, Genesis chapter 11, and the book of Daniel, and they removed 1,500 years to somehow slow down this Christian movement that was seeking, slow down this Christian movement that was literally causing Jews all over the Roman Empire and beyond to come to Jesus as their Messiah. And so, just in closing this talk today called the Messianic Prophecies that the rabbis attempted to hide, is that there's nothing hidden that will not be revealed. And some of this tampering and some of this so-called monkey business that the rabbis attempted to do to get people to disbelieve or not believe that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, we didn't even know for sure what the case was until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls being discovered. So we will be looking in the next in another session about more of the miraculous things about the Dead Sea Scrolls. But let me just close us in prayer. I hope you found this topic interesting. And these are not things that you hear when you study in a Bible school and a seminary. There's reasons why people don't want to go, cover this topic. But what we've seen is that ultimately God has preserved his word. He's preserved his Old Testament. We can know what the original Old Testament said, not just because we do have the Hebrew Bible that is preserved through the Masoretic text. We have quotations from the Greek Old Testament in our New Testament. We have the Greek Old Testament called the Septuagint. And then in 1947 and afterwards, the Lord allowed the Dead Sea Scrolls to be discovered, mostly in Hebrew, some in Aramaic, showing us that he has preserved his word. So God, I thank you that you have preserved your word. I thank you that when we open our Bibles today and we read your word, we know that we have your words because you have protected it. You have miraculously brought it down to us through the ages. And we thank you for that, God. And we pray all these things now in the name of Jesus. Amen.